I want to welcome you to the UK Fine Art Museum. Today we have some artwork laid out in our classrooms so that you can get some commentary by two invited guests, the education coordinator Dan Solberg and curator of collections and exhibitions Janie Welker. Hello. Okay, you guys take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Rob, for inviting us to come talk about the artwork we have up in our galleries today. I think the first piece that we're going to check out here is by Jeffrey Wallen, and this piece is it's a portrait of Mark Scully, who was a U.S. Army First Lieutenant, and it's part of a series that the artist did called Inconvenience Stories: Portraits of Vietnam War Veterans. And so I know we actually have another one of these photographs from the series up in the galleries right now as well. In addition to this one, we have pulled here from storage. I think what's kind of interesting about this one is it's got, it's paired with this text that is sort of, feels like equal importance to the photograph itself. Is that kind of how you sort of interpret this one as well, Jane?
Yeah, I think the text is really important because Jeff Wallen isn't a Vietnam veteran himself, but he grew up with a lot of people, knew a lot of people who did fight in Vietnam, and it was such a major trauma for people of that era, and he decided to go back and make portraits of veterans. And he started obviously with American veterans, but then what's kind of interesting is that he also started photographing Vietnamese veterans, both those who had worked with American troops in Vietnam and those who were on the other side. So it became, a much bigger body of work. I think the story, as you mentioned, the series is called Inconvenience Stories. And in this case, Mark Scully is telling a story about a Vietnamese commander who was working with the Americans, but who was extremely corrupt and, was making a lot of decisions that risked the lives of his soldiers, his Vietnamese soldiers, but also of Mark Scully. And even though he reported this behavior, the U.S. military refused to do anything about it and left him and his fellow soldiers in danger. And so, it's kind of an interesting story. And many of the vets that he photographed still had their uniforms from much earlier. This was shot in 2000. So he was over there in 1968, 69.
And I guess by putting the text in the picture, this could be something where ordinarily you could imagine this being like a wall text accompanying a photograph, but in some ways, I guess that would, depending on where a photograph might show up, the curator might choose different text to go with something. And so I guess by putting it here on the actual photograph, on the print, it's sort of ensuring that it is always 100% represented with the image.
Yeah. Because his story is really important, and he, it is part of the image, that the two are really linked. So I think that's a really good point. Actually, in some of the earlier series that he did of a different series, Jeff Wallen actually wrote on the photographs with marker so that the image, the text actually ran over parts of the image.
Well, that's cool. So this next image that we have here, Exhausted Globe from the Exhausted Globe series. And I'm actually not familiar with the rest of this series here, but this is certainly a striking image. It feels like there's something like, I can't quite tell if this person is being crushed, if they're trying to push something, or if they're comfortable. Like there's sort of like an interesting pose going on here that I can't quite place exactly. It's sort of in between a lot of things. I don't know, is there maybe more to sort of like, is there sort of more to the series that would potentially illustrate that? Are you aware of what other ones are in this grouping?
Well, all of the works in the series involve the artist Robert Park Harrison, who is shown in the dark suit, and he always wears this kind of very plain dark suit and white shirt. He's sort of stands in for an everyman, and the whole series kind of involves him building these big sculptures in his studio and photographing them, and a lot of detritus, a lot of junk, a lot of things that's left over. And so, you know, he was making this in 1997, so very early on he was talking about the environment, about what do we do with all the waste that we have and just throw away, you know, kind of all of those ideas, and that kind of permeates the series of work that he's done, and really it permeates a lot of his work. This concern really can, you know, is can be felt in a lot of his work, and it's kind of interesting because he uses an old technique, which is photogravure, and I know that Rob's always interested in some of these historic techniques, and this goes back to probably the 1880s. And it's a way of reproducing photographs mechanically, but in really fine, beautiful prints. In this case, it's waxed. It has like a wax surface on top of it that gives it kind of a soft appearance.
And that's sort of, you know, we're looking at an image here, but is that sort of that surface treatment? Is that kind of noticeable in person?
It is. In person, you know, it's a pretty big photograph, and in person, you can kind of see the application of wax on the surface of the print.
So this next one here is I am seeing on the medium is a daguerreotype, which I'm familiar with as sort of like one of the original forms of photography. It's at Grand Army Plaza in Manhattan, and but this it's not an old picture. This is from 2007, so it's maybe another artist kind of similar to the last one we're looking at, who's like looking backwards to some older processes.
Yeah, that's really true. Jerry Spagnoli is one of the artists who actually, he pioneered, or I should say, Jerry Spagnoli is an artist who recovered this kind of lost art of making daguerreotypes. They were very, very popular. The daguerreotype was introduced to the public in 1839, and you know, photographers had been experimenting with this all through the 1830s. And we're used to photographs on paper. This is actually a photograph that is on a polished sheet of metal. So in these images of it, it's kind of hard to see. It's kind of ghostly. In some places, you'll actually see reflections in it, because the metal that it is on top of is so polished and so bright, and you have to hold it. It has to be at just the right angle for you to actually see the image clearly. And in the old daguerreotypes that, you know, you might see in an antique mall or something like that, the metal generally has sort of oxidized over time, so it's not as bright as this, so we're not used to seeing it in such a pristine state.
Yeah, this is really one of the ones that, I mean, I think any, you know, work of art is typically going to benefit from seeing it in person if it's not a totally digital thing. But I think that something like this feels like particularly like it's actually kind of hard to see, you know, from a photograph, like just physically see it. It sort of takes, even seeing it in person, you kind of got to look around at a couple angles, almost like you're looking at like a hologram or something like that.
Yeah, it is like that. It does feel like that. And it feels like you can almost see layers of the image. And it's, yeah. So
we're going from sort of a process that I sort of recognize the name of to an artist name that was very recognizable to me from even kind of a young age. We had a poster of an Ansel Adams print up in our house growing up, and so it's a similar sort of scene, a snowy mountaintop. This is sort of a very pristine environment. I feel like is kind of one of the kind of iconic sorts of images that you would get from in Ansel Adams.
Yeah, it really is. Ansel Adams is known for working out west, often in Yosemite National Park, which is where this is. It's Half Dome along the Merced River. And he would go out into these like pristine wildernesses and make photographs in these great national parks that we have. And he's an interesting guy. I mean, he almost became a concert pianist. And so he's very interested in tones, whether they're musical tones or whether they're black and white photography. And he's known for making these photographs with these incredible, gray tones throughout the photograph, and often capturing the mood of a place, not just capturing the physical reality of it, but seeing it in a certain mood, in a certain light, certain times of year.
Mm-hmm. Didn't he does he famously use like a really small aperture as well? Is that how he gets like such a depth of field?
I don't know for sure. Probably. He was part of a group called the F64 group, and that's a really small aperture. So the smaller the aperture, generally the sharper the sharper the image. And you have to realize, of course, that he's taking this with a view camera with a very large negative. I would imagine it's either 4x5 or 8x10.
This Patrick Nagatani image really was striking to me in terms of the color being represented. In fact, the reproduction we have here, as far as the image, is a very different color palette. Hopefully you saw before this video went into a still, a little bit of the real kind of rich orangey red and these kind of other really strong desert tones that are present in this image that look a little washed out in this the reproduction or documentation, I should say, because the orange really has this irradiated glow to it, which seems pretty on point for the subject matter we're talking about here. And then there's this kind of picture-in-picture mode of this panorama. I don't know if you could maybe shed some light into the background of what's going on in this image.
Yeah, Patrick Nagatani, who made this photograph, made it on a Navajo reservation where companies had gone in to do uranium mining. And many of the Navajo residents worked, in this mining industry. And what he's showing is, the houses that you see in the main picture. And then in the photograph that's in the foreground, the photograph within the photographs, he's showing the view from the houses of this kind of what seems to be a pristine landscape. But by coloring the sky this vivid red-orange, he's referring to the uranium tailings, which are the leftovers from mining, and which are still, have a nuclear charge to them. And so many of the miners actually ended up getting sick, getting cancer from their exposure to the uranium. And so it's gone from this, pristine landscape to something that's contaminated through industry.
Is that the artist's hands that are holding up the panorama down there?
I don't know. I don't know if they are or not.
It's curious. It does give it kind of like a POV kind of perspective to it. I guess every camera photograph in some ways is often a POV perspective, but when you kind of have the hands out there, we can feel more kind of embodied in the space.
It does feel like he's reaching around the camera and holding that up, doesn't it? Yeah. And
then this Carrie Mae Weems image is really, there's something incredibly arresting about this image. There's the kind of high contrast between the black and the red, and then this text here, "Some said you were the spitting image of evil," is really like it's just startling and kind of disturbing to then have with the image that's overlaid, or I guess underlaid, underneath the text here. And, we sort of started by looking at the Jeffrey Wolin, which was also pairing image with text, but this doing it in quite a different way. I feel like there's a lot to unpack in this image. Where do you think we should start?
Well, I mean, it is kind of interesting to think about it, and about this Carrie Mae Weems photograph called "Some Said You Were the Spitting Image of Evil," in terms of the Wallen, because the text in the Wallen is actually the person in the photograph is speaking. That's his story. Mm-hmm. But in this case, she's making clear that that this interpretation was the way this young woman and other people of color were labeled. And Carrie Mae Weems was invited by the Getty Museum to go through their trove of photographs, historic photographs of African Americans. And so she rephotographed them and usually made them larger than they were originally, and very often tints them, in this case a red tint, which certainly could suggest anger, could suggest blood. Sometimes she's used a blue tint for the photographs. And she makes them round into this tondo form, which is kind of like a historic portraiture form. So she's presenting them, with dignity, but at the same time, talking about the way certain races and certain classes of people were labeled by society.
I also just kind of tend to really find it interesting when photography always feels like a medium that is more or less like outputting in rectilinear shapes, and then to have like a circle do that, it's sort of like, it feels more sort of like a peephole, or like it's provocative of the eye, or some sort of like telescope or kind of lens that you're looking through that way. It's I don't know. I always thought that was sort of an interesting sort of tack here, because I've seen a couple other photos that we have from her in our collection, and they're also circles.
Yeah, we have one other, and it is also a circle. It is interesting because because you're right. It does make you look twice. It's not what you really expect from a photograph. You would see that more in old oil paintings, for example. And so she is definitely setting it apart that way. And what's interesting is the text is actually sandblasted on top of the glass that covers it. So it's quite permanent.
Oh, cool! I had no idea.
Yeah.
Another thing you'd probably notice in person that is less apparent here in the image. So we're going to shift rooms here, and we're out now of kind of made our way through the galleries. And here up in the upstairs galleries, we have two exhibitions from our Robert C. May speaker series. The first one we're looking at here by Kitra Kahana, Caravana Migrante. And this one is focusing on, in 2018, the artist went to the US-Mexico border, I believe primarily in Tijuana, but I think maybe a couple other locations.
No, actually she started in Honduras and walked with the migrants from Honduras to Tijuana.
Okay, so they ultimately get there, but even before that. All right. Well, maybe, I know, Janie, you curated both of these exhibitions up here. Could you give us sort of an intro as to what's happening with them?
Yeah, this exhibition and another one that we're going to talk about by Erika Larson represents two photojournalists who work they embed themselves long-term in documentary projects. And they are very invested in the work, not only telling the story, they're invested not only in storytelling, but in also, seeing people, in a very personal way. So it's kind of a combination of documenting what's going on there, but also, trying to come to know the individuals and show them as individuals, not just as people that you see in the news who are, kind of struggling to, to cross a border, from Tijuana to America. Kitra Kahana is a photographer who often works for National Geographic, although she's a freelance photographer. And she's really interested in issues around social justice. And so she was photographing the migrants in toward the end of 2018 and 2019. And she actually went down to Honduras and traveled with the migrant caravan up to Tijuana. And so this show looks at some of those works, and it kind of starts out with photographs of people trying to cross the border or being stopped trying to cross the border, and then goes on into kind of the landscapes that they encounter, and finally ends up with some portraits of individuals, kind of looking at them, as I said, not just as news stories, but as individuals with, parents with children, people with hopes, of a different kind of life in the United States. And so one of the, images that I find very, very effective is this kind of silhouette of people trying to get across the border, and they've been tear gassed. And so it's one of the reasons it's at night. There are floodlights on, but it's very murky, in part because of the tear gas that's hanging through there. And one of the things that I think about when I look at this is the fact that, the photographer herself was part of this. She was in this whole scrum of people, and she was photographing as they were doing this. So, she was kind of right in the midst of this. And one of the things that she's looked at over and over again in her photographs is sort of this conjunction of how close, these people are right at the border. They can see the United States and how close they are, but also the experience for the Border Patrol as well, and the relationship between the Border Patrol and and the immigrants. So in this second picture that I'm showing, it's, you can see there's this kind of, fence above, and there's someone standing above, a Border Patrol person standing above, and then these migrants kind of in the shadow of the wall below. And, they're so separate, but at the same time, they're so close together. And I think a lot of people don't really think about that. And on this third image is kind of an area where the migrants first gathered, and so there was just this kind of whole, this incredible variety of people and colors. And Dan, you were mentioning specifically the light in the photograph, because
yeah, it's kind of amazing saturation, but also like it looks cloudy, but there must be like sun bursting through, more towards where the camera is, because it's not showing up in the image, but there's no other way that you could get that kind of illumination, it doesn't seem like.
No, and the dark clouds on the horizon sort of become metaphors in a way. And you can see that these people have just been stopped here, and they have nowhere to go. They're sort of, they can't move forward across the border. It's just waiting. It's a lot of waiting for them. And it looks like, this almost looks like a painting to me, the way all the people are arranged, but clearly she was just there in place and making photographs.
I mean, it really feels like you get that sense of embeddedness as far as sort of like being a photographer, being an artist in this sort of an environment, like in terms of like, there's like a closeness. And I think this certainly comes up when we will look at the portraits.
Right.
The idea of sort of a relationship that would a conversation at the very least that has to take place between the artist and the subjects being photographed. But also just like, with that first one you showed of the silhouettes, it's like you couldn't get that photograph unless you were in there with the people doing this. It just wouldn't, there's no other way to get it.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, a lot of times she was out at night photographing, and what you mentioned about the portraits is that there had to be a certain level of trust between the people who were letting her photograph them. And also she was photographing, it was with their permission. She couldn't be making those kinds of portraits if they didn't, give her permission to do that. So, she's someone who will quite frequently embed herself, possibly for months at a time, working with a group of people. I think that it's very different than just showing up for a few days and taking some photographs and leaving.
Yeah, there's something that I feel like it builds, I'm sure it builds trust, and sort of, I don't know, there's probably then a little bit more of a, I don't know, that you want to sort of like, if you get to know people, you want to sort of make sure that their struggle, that somehow there's an awareness and sort of a greater knowledge of like what's actually going on with the people that are doing this, as opposed to just sort of this further away, objective, quote unquote, objective view of the situation.
Yeah, I think that's really, really true. She's actually been blocked from making the border crossing there by the government.
I'm not surprised.
She's not allowed. So if she wants to come into Mexico, she has to fly to some country south of there and then
go over on
that side. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like that's the price. The price you would know going into it, you would probably have to pay for.
Yeah, she and several other photojournalists have been blacklisted.
So the other exhibition you mentioned, Erika Larson, is another part of our Robert C. May lecture series, and you mentioned also that she also is she travels a lot. It sort of goes all over the world, and is a freelancer who also gotten a lot of work for National Geographic.
Yeah, she again, she was someone who started out with ideas for projects that she wanted to do, and she would start to do them. Her first project was in the Scandinavian Arctic among the Sami people. And she actually traveled there and worked as a housekeeper so that she could live there and become, kind of embedded in the society there. And over the years, she was always really interested in people who live very close to the land, cultures that live very close to the land. And she's really, concerned about climate change and how it impacts a lot of these different, societies and cultures. But also how they're adapting to it and how, they change their lives and create, different rituals and kind of adapting to things that happen. So the photograph of the young man who is sitting in his living room, this photograph is called Daniel's Catch. He's sitting in, what otherwise seems to be a common living room, except that he has slaughtered animals in front of him that have been butchered. There's a rack behind him holding meat that's being dried to save it for the winter. And he's sitting there, casually talking on his cell phone. So for him, it's much more common to do this than to drive to a grocery store, which may be hundreds of miles away from there. And this is in Quinnipiac, Alaska, which is near the Bering Sea. And it's a place where, as different, as the climate has changed and water levels have changed, there has been a recovery of like old artifacts that go way back in time, and it's kind of spurred a lot of their inhabitants to start practicing the old ways. Although I think that they were already still doing, subsistence, living, in which they would live off the land by hunting or gathering, gathering berries, by fishing salmon. You can see the little girl in the second photograph is laying on, is what actually a sewage line for the village. So she's been, up working for, who knows how many hours, and she just was exhausted and fell asleep. And the salmon, which has been, dressed and is hanging behind her to dry, is what will help keep her family alive during the winter. But she's gone, Erika Larson's gone everywhere from the, Scandinavian Arctic to the Canadian Arctic, to Alaska, but also to places like Peru, or in the case of the three women that we see here, the three weavers, which is grandmother, mother, and daughter, to the Sierra Nevada mountains in Colombia. And these women are weavers, and they're weaving baskets, but they're also very involved in ritual in their society in various ways. So they're part of, I don't know if you would say a shaman class, but certainly sort of a healing, classes of healers. And so, once again, we talked about Kitra Kahana being in the midst of everything that was going on at the Mexico American border, and Erika Larson had to hike into the Sierra Nevada mountains. I mean, she wasn't airlifted in. She hiked, she walked there with the people, and so these are lives that she's also lived.
Yeah, I believe I was at her talk. I remember her saying that she tried to sort of participate in as much of the cultures as she kind of could, to really sort of get in tune with and sort of communicate really intimately with the people that she was looking to photograph and to document. And so, as she mentioned about like how she tried walking barefoot with everyone in this environment, but it was too hard on her feet. She tried it for a certain amount of time, but she just couldn't, her feet just couldn't take it. And it was just sort of, just like the idea of, she even it was almost like kind of upsetting, because it meant that there's sort of this physical connection then to the land, just the idea of being barefoot, that then if you feel like you can't do it, you can't have then that connection that others do have, then you have to wear something that separates you from the land in some way.
Right. Yeah, that's really true. And she's someone who is very much in tune, with the environment and with the people that she's photographed.
Yeah, and I mean, well, actually, just speaking of footwear real quick, to go back to the first image you were talking about, it's because one of the things that really sells me on that image is the socks and flip-flops.
I know.
That's it's just so this is a day at work, this is a day working from home, right? Yeah. I'm around the house, and it's just, instead of me here with my computer monitor, it's here with dead caribou or whatever. I'm not sure what kind of animals they are.
Yeah, I'm not. I think that it is caribou, but I'm not sure either.
And it's just this is just how it is, and
just kind of in the middle of the floor there. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan Solberg and Janie Welker. I appreciate your guys' time and thoughtful commentary. I'm leaving up some extra information about the museum, just in case you're interested in ever visiting.